Recently, I think there are more and more concerns and developments around very broad macro issues and mostly strategic ones between different countries that are kind of surfaced to the top to many of these investors' minds. A lot of people are talking about geopolitics, the US China relationship, the Taiwan issue, the de dollarization efforts, and whether the USD will still hold its reserve currency status, the petrodollar, Saudi Arabia, Russia, Ukraine, etc., etc. I'm not too sure why, but yeah, there are increasingly a lot of these sort of macro strategies that are cosplaying as investors, explaining to you how this is going to cause the bond market to implode, how the stock market is going to be affected, how it's going to strike into recessionary fears, etc., etc. Personally, I do believe that many of these developments, or at least these different undercurrents of the markets, have been there, at least have been there for the last decade or so. But it does seem like it's getting more pronounced. People are putting in more efforts, and everybody is just debating vigorously and aggressively on the online space. Particularly so because of the advent of internet technology, whatever. So I think I just wanted to kind of just dispel this idea, or maybe just provide a different perspective, because we all know that, oh, this decoupling issue is going to be a big issue. Your portfolio is going to suffer. China is going to take the world, take on the entire Western alliance, etc., etc. So just to provide a different perspective, because many of these narratives here, it just strikes me as very interesting, and I'm not too sure how many people actually take it wholeheartedly without any level of skepticism. Just to provide you with a very quick example here. So Sophia, I think she's one of the highly respected reporters or journalists out there, and she tweeted something like that at the start of this month. So this on the 1st of June 2023. So as Chinese stocks slump, indexes in India are near a record, in Japan near a 3-decade high, and the Kospi in South Korea is entering a bull market. So probably one of her colleagues or something like that writes about the structural reallocation of capital in Asia away from China. So then she provided this graph. Evidently, it's quite a simple graph to understand. She's just comparing how the indexes are moving, and just comparing the results and performances. First things first, when she does this sort of comparison, the first thing I look at is the timeline, which is the x-axis. The timeline is 1 year. So this is exactly what is happening over the last 5-6 months or so. So is that really a very representative data? I'm sure for investors out there, for those of you who are long-term investors, you will know that at least less than a year, or even within 18 months to 24 months, under 2 years, all the data are noises. Short-term market fluctuations, anything can happen. It's all sentiments, narrative driven. And then she just compares the major indexes. And then the interesting index she used was actually Hang Seng. So not really the real China index, not the A-shares index, but Hang Seng in this case. So you can see that as denoted by the blue line here, the Hang Seng, yes, it's down near 10%. And for the rest of the indexes, they were all rallying and entering a bull market, as she claims. The interesting thing is the first index that caught my attention was actually this peach or pink color line. It's actually the Taiwan Stock Exchange. So according to her entire thesis and rhetoric of how China is gonna be a very big issue about the entire US-China relationship, but evidently the Taiwan index is rallying upwards, and it actually outperformed many of the indexes that she talked about. So clearly, the entire threat, or the advent of the threat, that China is going to potentially invade Taiwan in the near future is a non-existent threat, because evidently investors don't really care, which is why they're bidding the stock price of China up, or in this case Taiwan. Let me rephrase myself, Taiwan up, not China. So even though there's a one China policy. But anyway, just to keep in mind that specifically for China indexes, there are a few. There's the Shanghai one, there's the Shenzhen one, there's the Hong Kong one, and then there's this Taiwan one. So evidently the US-China or the China-Taiwan issue is not is a non-issue. Secondly, according to her logic, whoever's or whichever country's indexes are performing badly means that there is a structural reallocation of capital. That's the words that she used, by the way. I quote, structural reallocation of capital in Asia. So let's pick another company in Asia, and it's my home country, Singapore. I love Singapore, by the way. So let's look at Singapore index. So Singapore's index is actually STI, which is the Straits Time Index. Looking at a year-to-date basis, Singapore actually, the STI index itself is actually down as well. So it started out in the 3rd of Jan at 3.29, $3.29, and it's at 3.25 now. So if I were to plot the STI in, the STI is probably much closer to this grey index, or even lower, because it's probably very tied to the zero performance. So in this case, is there a structural reallocation of capital in Asia where money is also moving away or moving out of Singapore? I'm not too sure because of the different nuances. The Singapore property market is actually booming. There are many billionaires from China, from Indonesia, from wherever, parking their monies in the Singapore property sector. But our stock market is evidently not working very well, at least based on this very rudimentary and very rough way of kind of trying to understand the reallocation of capital. So in this case, you can see that number one, it doesn't really tell you much. And number two, it fits into the narrative that she's trying to portray, which is there is a reallocation of capital. So here's the interesting thing, right? Does it really paint the full story? I don't think so. Does she have a bias or inherent narrative? Evidently. And it really doesn't say much. So that's why I say, even of like many of these esteemed journalists, people that are in the industry for a very long time, just take many of these data points with just a pinch of salt. Everybody has a particular direction that they wish to drive, and you as the endpoint consumer, whether it's on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, you make your own decision. I'm not here to tell you that this decoupling is not happening. In fact, I do believe that this undercurrents of decoupling, or this idea of US manufacturing being brought back home, this entire semiconductor strategic issue, many of these developments will be structural in nature. So data points aside, I think for many investors, you need to exercise a certain level of independent thinking. And personally for me, I can kind of briefly share what I think of this issue because it's going to be a very brief video. If you to really look at the holdings that I have on my current portfolio, I'm actually decoupling on my end. So Apple, no doubt, is an extremely profitable and well-run company. That being said, I think we all know that they have a very strong reliance in terms of the Chinese demand for their iPhones, and iPhone makes up a bulk of their entire revenue and earnings pie. So from this perspective, how do I decouple my portfolio is when I look at US companies, many of the US big tech that I own are currently Meta, Alphabet, and Amazon. And if you were to just compare these three, most of them, if not all of them, don't have China exposure or China footprint. You can technically argue that many of Amazon products do come from Chinese merchants, and I do acknowledge that fact. But just looking at Meta and Alphabet alone, both of them don't have footprints in China. In fact, they're actually banned in China, and they didn't bother pursuing the Chinese market. On the flip side, many of these other companies, Apple, LVMH, Tesla, they have very strong ties to the Chinese market. And whenever this entire geopolitical tension escalates, then yes, everybody is going to be swirled into this whole entire mess. And I'm not too sure how it's going to affect their business, but it's a movie that we are all waiting for it to play out, and we don't know what to expect, to be very, very frank, even if we to ask many of these long-time investors in many of these companies. Of course, touch wood, I don't think anything major will happen, despite many of these people on the side drumming around and asking China to invade Taiwan, or saying that, oh, it's an inevitable outcome and stuff like that. I don't stand in that camp. But that said, personally, how do I decouple? When I hold Chinese companies, specifically Alibaba and Tencent, most of their revenues are derived, at least 80-90% is derived in China. On the flip side, Amazon, Meta, Alphabet, they also mostly derive from the rest of the world, ex-China. So that's just basically my broad level thinking when I look at many of these MNCs or international companies. And then here comes the last point. I do hold a particular company that is caught between this tension, which is TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor. I do have my own specific thesis around it, and if I really am afraid that China is going to invade Taiwan and it's an inevitable outcome in the near future, I wouldn't even be holding a Taiwanese company. So no, that is I say categorically, I don't think they're going to invade anytime soon, and I do hope that there is an amicable outcome that comes out from this. But as a bystander, I just want to make this very interesting observation that I had. So on one hand, many of these international investors say that, oh, China is the big bad enemy. They are going to invade Taiwan. They are essentially undermining the US hegemony and the entire Western alliance values, etc., and want to pin them down. Yet at the same time, for many of these so-called investors on the sidelines that have this sort of rhetoric, they are also holding on to many of these companies like Apple or Tesla that have a huge demand reliance on the Chinese market as well. So what exactly do you want? Do you want the world, or do you want US and China to come to an amicable resolution and to everybody to work together? Or do you want them to kind of fight it out? And if they do fight it out and there is more and more this kind of tariffs, they slap onto each other, fines, and then they start sending military equipment and try to cause even more tension, isn't it bad for your portfolio? Or isn't it bad for all these companies that do have huge exposure to these Chinese markets? I just don't understand, but that's just my own perspective. Do feel free to leave in the comment section down below what do you think. Oh, and one more thing before I forget, I wanted to flesh it out. This is essentially an article that was kind of published on one of the Chinese state-owned newspaper. In Chinese, it reads, 增强对 A 股市场的信心、决心和耐心. If you allow me to translate, it just means that to increase the market's confidence, determination, and patience for the A shares market. What does it mean? I leave it up to you to decide, but it does seem like they are trying to instill back investors' confidence back into their own mainland stock market. Does it have a spillover effect to the Hong Kong and subsequently all these ADRs? I'm not too sure, but let's look forward to see what they actually mean by this, and whether, I mean, there are a lot of speculations around saying that the government is going to introduce even more support measures to many of these markets, whether is it public or private, and there are even potential discussions around a stimulus package. Who knows? But yeah, with that, see you in the next video. More importantly, I will finally see you on the moon. Goodbye.